The first thing anyone noticed was the silence, an unnatural calm rolling through Rikers Island, like the city had paused just long enough to hear it breathe again. For a place built on noise, that silence was the most dangerous sound of all. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this one only gets darker. It started on a gray winter morning, the kind where fog clung to the razor wire and made every corner feel like a warning. Captain Luis Moreno had been on the island for nearly 20 years, long enough to see reforms rise and fall like the tides hitting the Bronx shoreline. But what he saw that morning was different, a hallway full of officers frozen in place, staring at a memo clipped to the wall outside the command post. A federal oversight team was returning to Rikers, earlier than expected, and with full authority to intervene. For some officers, it was a relief. For others, it was a threat. For the inmates, it meant hope or retaliation. Moreno walked the corridor with a heaviness he'd learned to carry silently. Rikers had been under scrutiny for years: use of force incidents, medical neglect, failed staffing, and stories that never should have made it out. But the latest federal report had hit like a sledgehammer. It listed more than statistics, it named patterns, failures, and responsibility. And rumors swirled that the next step wasn't oversight, but federal takeover. Inside Housing Unit 3 West, the atmosphere shifted the moment the news spread. Inmates read the tension on the officers' faces the way some people read the weather. They knew something had changed. One of them, a 28-year-old detainee named Arlen Drew, watched everything from the corner of the day room. He'd been on the island for 8 months awaiting trial, long enough to learn that information could be as dangerous as any weapon. He noticed officers walking in tighter formations. Radios clicked with shorter conversations. Doors opened slower, closed faster. Something was coming. Around noon, the first flashpoint hit. An argument between two officers broke out near the Sally Port, loud enough that inmates stopped talking and leaned forward, listening. Moreno stepped in, separated them, and ordered both back to their posts. But the message was already circulating through the block. The staff was divided. The island was shifting. Oversight was here. By late afternoon, the fog had lifted from the outside world, but inside Rikers, it felt thicker than ever. In the staff cafeteria, whispers ran wild. They're bringing in new monitors. They're reviewing every use of force file. They're interviewing detainees directly, no filters. Some welcomed it. Others feared exposure. Inmates felt the ripple effect instantly. Officers worked slower, spoke less, kept their distance. A few tried to present a cleaner image, but those who'd been here long enough could tell when the island was performing and when it was panicking. That night, during the final count, Arlen noticed something small but telling. The usual officer who handled their tier, a man known for cutting corners, was gone. Replaced. He exchanged a look with another detainee. Rikers didn't change routines without reason. After lights out, the hum of the unit settled into a low drone. The city outside kept moving, but inside the block, time felt still. Arlen lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled footsteps of the night shift. And then he heard it, a door opening at the far end of the hallway, followed by urgent whispers. Not staff. Not inmates. Something in between. Something official. Footsteps moved with purpose, heading toward the administrative wing. Papers rustled. Keys jingled. Then, silence. A silence that felt like the prelude to a storm. Arlen sat up, heart pounding, because he knew exactly what that sound meant. The federal oversight team wasn't just visiting. They were already inside. By morning, the silence on Rikers had changed shape. It wasn't the calm before a storm anymore, it was the pressure after lightning, when everyone knows something's been struck, but not what will burn next. The federal monitors set up in a small, windowless office off the main corridor. No uniforms, no rank on their collars. Just badges, laptops, and an expression that made both officers and detainees uneasy. They weren't here to posture. They were here to listen. Captain Moreno watched from the doorway as interviews began. Officers were called in one at a time, starting with the ones everyone whispered about, the loudest, the roughest, the ones whose reports always looked cleaner than the truth. Down in 3 West, word spread faster than paperwork ever could. Detainees leaned close to the bars, trading rumors like currency. Some said units were about to be shut down. Others said the feds were hunting for a scapegoat. No one wanted to be the first to talk. No one wanted to be the last, either. For Arlen, the pressure came from both sides. Inside the unit, he still had to answer to the quiet chain of command that really ran the block, the housing reps, the jailhouse lawyers, the men who controlled the phones and the flow of food. Outside the unit, he could feel the system shifting above him, like concrete cracking in slow motion. In the afternoon, a counselor he barely knew slid a folded notice through his cell door. "You've been requested," she said. "Federal oversight team. Tomorrow." Her voice carried no threat, only a strange uncertainty, as if even she didn't know whether this was opportunity or danger. That night, the unit divided along invisible lines. Some detainees rehearsed what they'd say, medical requests that vanished, force incidents that never made the logs, nights where calls for help echoed unanswered. Others warned silence was safer. "Don't be stupid," an older inmate muttered to Arlen at Chow. "You talk, you're a rat. You stay quiet, nothing changes. Rikers don't love heroes, kid. It buries them." Across the walls, officers were having their own version of the same argument. In the locker room, Moreno listened as younger COs vented their fears. "They're gonna put this all on us," one said. "City leaves us understaffed for years, then acts shocked when it falls apart." Another countered, "Or maybe the feds finally get enough proof to force the city's hand. Maybe this is the only way anything changes." Moreno didn't take sides. He'd filed reports that were buried before they reached a desk, written memos no one bothered to read. He knew what it meant to be punished for silence and punished for honesty, just in different ways. The next morning, Arlen sat in a metal chair across from 2 federal monitors and a recorder blinking with a small red light. No bars. No shouting. No keys jingling. Just questions. They didn't want stories. They wanted specifics, dates, names, who was on duty, who responded, who didn't. At first, Arlen kept things vague. Then one of them slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of grievances he'd filed months ago, grievances he assumed had disappeared into the void. "We've read everything you wrote," one monitor said. "It didn't vanish. It was flagged." The word hit harder than any threat. Flagged. For the first time since he'd arrived on the island, Arlen realized something he hadn't allowed himself to believe. Someone outside was actually tracking what happened in here, line by line, complaint by complaint. He thought he'd been shouting into darkness. But the darkness had been listening and keeping receipts. The day the monitors released their preliminary findings, the island felt like it was holding its breath. Officers walked the halls with clipped steps. Detainees kept closer to their cells. Even the usual shouts from distant tiers seemed muted, swallowed by a tension that stretched from one end of Rikers to the other. Captain Moreno stood in the command post reading the report summary as it printed, page after page listing failures the city could no longer deny. Staffing shortages. Delayed medical responses. Breakdown in procedure. Cases that had been closed without investigation. Patterns that painted a truth no one could argue with anymore. For once, the paper didn't hide the story. The monitors didn't call out names, but everyone knew the implications. Supervisors who ignored red flags. Officers who cut corners. Administrators who signed off without looking. In a system that had been stretched so thin, it eventually started breaking on its own weight. In 3 West, the reaction rippled differently. Some detainees felt a cautious sense of victory. Others suspected the system would protect itself before protecting them. But Arlen felt something more complicated. He felt seen, in a way he hadn't since the day he stepped inside. His interview wasn't mentioned in the report, but the patterns matched his experience too clearly to ignore. Someone had listened. Someone had cared enough to document it. Still, the aftermath wasn't simple. 2 officers from the unit were reassigned. A lieutenant was placed on leave. A medical supervisor was removed temporarily pending review. Each change sparked whispers, theories, and warnings. Arlen heard his name come up in conversations he'd rather have avoided. But then something happened that shifted the entire tone of the block. New staff arrived, officers who weren't part of the old rhythms, who followed procedure down to the letter, who logged every minor incident with near-clinical precision. For the first time in months, meal trays arrived on time. Sick call lines moved. Recreation was open consistently. It wasn't a miracle, but it was structure, and structure in a place like Rikers could feel like hope or threat, depending on who you asked. Moreno saw the shift too. He noticed the small things, the absence of shouting down the corridor, fewer emergency calls over the radio, the way officers didn't look over their shoulders as often. Federal oversight hadn't fixed Rikers, but it had forced the island to look at itself, and that alone was seismic. One afternoon, as Arlen returned from visitation, he passed one of the monitors walking toward the admin wing. She paused, gave him a small nod, nothing more. Not a signal, not a promise. Just an acknowledgement that his voice had not dissolved into the walls. Later that night, he sat on his bunk listening to the quiet hum of the unit. Not silence, just a calmer kind of noise. The kind that comes when people finally realize someone is watching, and accountability isn't a rumor anymore. Still, he understood the truth: Rikers wouldn't transform overnight. Oversight wasn't a cure, it was pressure. And pressure could either build something stronger, or expose every crack until the structure collapsed. Captain Moreno stood outside the housing unit that same evening, staring through the reinforced glass at a place he'd spent half his life inside. He didn't know whether federal involvement meant the island's downfall or its rebirth. But for the first time in years, he felt the faint possibility that the job might become what it was supposed to be. Not punishment. Responsibility. As lights dimmed across the complex, Arlen lay back and let the moment settle, uncomfortable, uncertain, but undeniably real. Rikers hadn't changed. Not yet. But it had been forced to admit something it had avoided for decades. The world was watching now. And watching changes everything. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.